Welcome to the nursery of the house. So Dr. Houston and his wife, they have 4 daughters who all shared this room. Their daughters were Elizabeth, Isabella, Anne, and Sally. So if those names sound familiar to you, that's because you're on Elizabeth Street. The next street over is Isabella Street. Anne Street was originally behind the house but got bisected by Route 13 and is now on the other side of Route 13 in the railroad tracks. And the other daughter, Sally, who's really Miss Sarah, she didn't get a street. We don't know why. So all the girls, like I said, shared this room. So as you can see, there's 2 beds in here. So there would have been 2 girls per bed. Now, if the girls had had a brother, he also would have been in this room. This is a time in history where all children shared the same room, up until about a certain age. When a boy hit about 12 years old, he was done at home. He was being apprenticed out, he was going off to military school or going off to boarding school. And by the time a girl is 14 or 15 years old, she's also done at home. She's getting married and she's moving out and starting her own household. Now, this is also a time in history where children were meant to be quiet and keep to themselves upstairs and out of the way. They were not meant to be seen and heard. So while the household was busy with all of his activities, the children would have spent their time up here in the nursery, very seldom coming downstairs, especially if there were guests in the house. If there were guests in the house, children would not have been permitted downstairs for any reason except for after dinner. They were the after dinner entertainment. They would come down and put on maybe a skit or perform a play they had written or read poetry or read from other books, possibly play some music. But it was a way of showing off the girls and not for them to actually interact with the guests. It was a way for Dr. Houston to show all of his girls, see how lovely my daughters are. They will make wonderful wives for your sons. They wouldn't have gone to school. They had a private tutor come in, and that private tutor was able to teach them. They would have learned a lot of different things here, including sewing. We have samplers on the wall that show them how to do different stitches. So that was a very common thing for girls to do back then. They also would have learned basic understanding of math, nothing too fancy, just enough to run a household. Reading and writing, of course, a little bit of history, some art, how to paint, how to draw, some art history. They would have learned about the classics. They also would have learned how to identify things in nature. So a little bit of earth science, how to identify plants and animals. That way they would know what was okay to be around, what was poisonous, and not to touch those things. Because the girls also would have been encouraged to go outside occasionally and get some exercise in. Their father was a surgeon. He was also on the town commission here in Salisbury and part owner of a bank. He was busy. He didn't have time to be around his children. And their mother, she would have been overlooking the farm. 357-acre farm and the household, somebody needed to look over that, and that would have been their mother's job. So, whose job was it to raise the children? One of the enslaved women. And this is where the tragic story of the house comes in. Oral history tells us that the woman who looked after the children, her name was Sarah. Lots of Sarahs with this house. And Sarah was in here one night, stoking the fire at the fireplace, getting it ready for the girls. And she got just a little too close to the fire. Her long dress caught on fire, and she was totally engulfed in flames as a result of the fire. You can actually still see scorch marks on the floor from the fire, including a burn mark that burned a hole through the floor. And they repatched over it with leather. That's their patch job from the 1800s. So one of the other things we always like to mention is what girls were wearing. There were 4 girls in the house, plus their mother, plus the enslaved women. So fashion of the day is this type of dress. This is an empire waist. So you'll notice the high waist on it for more freedom. Unlike the colonial times where you had a more natural waist and much more corset, this is much more free-flowing. And this kind of goes along with the idea that children right now, during this time period in the federal period, they were actually encouraging children to play more, especially as the middle class was rising. So children were encouraged to play. And by playing, they needed more loose-fitting clothes and clothes they could actually flow and play in. So the other bed that's in here is a canopy bed. So the canopy bed, most people are familiar with canopy beds, so-called because it has a canopy over it. On this bed actually is a beautiful quilt. This quilt is from 1840. Believe it or not, this is a political quilt. The pattern on this quilt is called a Democratic Whig pattern for the Whig Party. So the Whig Party was popular in the 1820s and 30s, and this was a way for women to show their political affiliation. Back then, of course, women couldn't vote. But in order to show their support for different candidates, they would make these types of quilts and then possibly hang them out on their front after laundering them. I mentioned the girls back then would have done all their education in this room. So this piece here is a great idea. It's a multi-purpose piece of furniture. This is actually called a butler's desk, where it's not only a dresser of drawers, but it's also, as you can see, it folds down into a desk. It saves on space because they only have to have one piece of furniture doing dual duty. When we're here on the second floor of the house, we always like to draw attention to the Palladian window. So we're very proud of our Palladian windows here at Poplar Hill Mansion. They're some of the finest examples of Palladian windows in the state. In fact, when Maryland Historical Trust gives presentations about historic architecture throughout the state, they oftentimes will show a slide of Poplar Hill Mansion just to showcase our Palladian windows. So if you look out of our Palladian window, you'll notice that the road leading up to the house is Poplar Hill Avenue. Well, that's the original driveway of Poplar Hill Mansion. So originally, the driveway was lined with Lombardy poplar trees, which are tall, skinny trees, almost like Italian cypress trees. And those lined the driveway all the way down to what is now downtown Salisbury. And at the time the house was built, that was still a lake, Lake Humphreys. So we stretched out the 357 acres in front of the house. All of that was farmland, with the main driveway leading down to the lake. So when people would come to visit by boat, they would come up the driveway and see the house as the main focus. And also, because we are on a slight hill, so we're on a hill, and we were lined with Lombardy poplar trees, that's how we get our nickname, Poplar Hill Mansion. One of the pieces here at Poplar Hill that everyone always seems to enjoy is our 1890s music box. So it does work. Like it? All of these discs that we can play, and the way it works is, you'll notice on the back of it, it's perforated. It's because they've punched the holes through the metal. And this piece here, as it's playing, all of these are going up and down, but where the holes are, that's where they're going up further and coming down and actually making the noise. So new for the 2024 season, we had done an entire exhibit about the history and influence of sugar in the early 1800s. I don't think most people realize how important sugar was during this time period. You know, nowadays we go to the grocery store, we pick up a bag of sugar for $2 and we don't think much of it. Back then, sugar was a very expensive commodity. They had to import sugar, and sugar usually grows in tropical climates, especially sugar cane, which is what they would have had here at Poplar Hill Mansion. The doctor would have used sugar as part of his medicinal routine. So sugar was used to treat indigestion. That's the main purpose of sugar. And he probably would have melted it down and mixed it with herbs, because herbs were also used to treat certain ailments, again, like indigestion. So he could have mixed it with peppermint. That would have been a popular one, because that does help stomach aches. So he would have melted that down with some peppermint, and he would have made candy and lozenges for people. So that old saying, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, was really true, especially during this time in history. Sugar, of course, is also used in culinary, but not as much as we would think, like we do nowadays. So back then, they didn't quite use sugar as much, but it was starting to become more and more popular. But like I said, sugar was expensive. It was usually kept under lock and key because it was so expensive. And here in the exhibit, we do have a sugar chest that shows how they would have kept the sugar back then under lock and key. Sugar was also usually made in cones. So here at the mansion, we have a cone mold on display. And if it wasn't sold in cones, it would have been sold by the quarter barrel. So a quarter barrel was called a firkin, which is also a very fun word to say. But the firkin looks kind of like a pail or a bucket, but is actually a measurement. It's a quarter of a barrel. Sugar was so important, it was part of the triangular trade. Now, if you're not familiar with the triangular trade, it was the importation of slaves from Africa. So slaves from Africa were being taken to the West Indies, down in the Caribbean, where they'd be used out in the sugarcane fields and the production of sugar, which would be used for things like molasses and rum. Those items would come to America, we'd import them back to England, and it would go back to Africa and continue the trade route. So in the development of slavery here in America, sugar was the most important aspect of that. That's before the cotton gin was invented and before cotton became king. So in order to try to subdue our relationship with the West Indies and their sugar production, Thomas Jefferson, he actually came up with a plan, or he supported a plan that was really presented to him by the Quakers and also Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was also against slavery. And they came up with a plan in the early 1800s called the Sugar Maple Scheme. And the Sugar Maple Scheme was to plant sugar maple trees all up and down the East Coast of the United States and have people get their sugar from the trees rather than relying on the sugar cane from the West Indies. Well, the idea didn't really catch on, except in one place in particular. When Jefferson went to visit Vermont, he started talking to farmers up in Vermont about this plan to become more self-sufficient. And Vermonters, if you know anything about them, they are totally self-sufficient in every way possible. So the Vermont farmers, they started planting all these sugar maples. Well, today, if you look at the production of maple syrup, Vermont is the leading producer in the United States of maple syrup. And that's why it all came back to Thomas Jefferson. Now here at the mansion, the doctor himself, again, would have relied on sugar not only for medicine, but also we know that he had sugar in other things, because on his inventory it lists different sugar products, including glass sugar goblets, which we have on display here at the mansion. He also had sugar talls, and he also had a caster. Now a caster is basically a sugar shaker. So we see sugar shakers today. It looks like a big salt and pepper shaker, but they were used for sugar back then. Over here we have a picture basically showcasing what the production of sugar would have looked like. So in the distance you can see them cutting down the sugar cane in the fields, and they're bringing that in. Where here in the forefront they show them cutting down the sugar cane into more manageable sized pieces, where they're taking it in and boiling it off. And you can see them pouring the sugar cones into the mold, and then right below that you see the finished product of all of the sugar cones being ready to send out for export. So this gentleman here, this is Major General Levin Winder. So he was the governor of Maryland during the War of 1812. He's fairly local, he's from Princess Anne. So he was born just south of here and raised here on the Eastern Shore. Winder is actually a very popular name, as you know, here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So Governor Winder, he's probably not what most people would consider the best governor of Maryland. He was a member of the Federalist Party, and that meant that he was against going to war with England during the War of 1812. It wasn't until the British started sailing up the Chesapeake Bay and her tributaries and started burning the homes of prominent citizens along those waterways, and also burning Washington, D.C., that he finally stepped in and said, maybe we should do something about this. So to his credit, he was able to get troops to Baltimore in time to save Baltimore from the same fate as being burned to the ground as Washington. And that's where we have the very famous Battle of Baltimore, which took place on September 14, 1813. There was a bombardment of a certain Fort McHenry, and there was a lawyer off the coast who was on board a ship, and he happened to witness the bombardment, and he wrote a poem about it, where he witnessed the bombs bursting in the air. And from that poem, he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which we now associate, of course, with our national anthem and the American flag. And last but not least here at Poplar Hill Mansion, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention one of our favorite people. This is a portrait of Bertha Lewis. Now Bertha, she owned an antique store here in Salisbury in the 1970s. And when the city acquired the property and decided to turn it into a museum, Bertha absolutely hated the idea of them showing an empty house to the public. So Bertha took it upon herself, and she loaned many of the artifacts and furnishings here in the mansion to us in the 1970s when we opened. When she died in 1994 at the age of 100, she then bequeathed all the furniture to us, but her stipulation was the portrait of her needed to stay in the house at all times. So when the family knew about this and donated her portrait, they also donated her husband's portrait to the mansion. That way they could be together.